Jason Williams drove in silence along the road leading to the small town of Clearwater, his mind invaded by memories he thought he had left behind. The smell of recent rain mixed with the dust kicked up by the storm that had ravaged the town, including his family's house, the place where he had grown up. His father's call had been brief and to the point. The house was destroyed by the storm. "We need your help." Jason knew that help meant more than just rebuilding walls and roofs. He hadn't returned to that town since he left to build a better life in New York, where he had become a respected businessman. His parents' house, though full of memories, also held invisible scars. The years of prejudice his family had endured, both from the community and within their own home. When Jason finally saw the old house on the horizon, a mix of nostalgia and pain washed over him. The facade, once a beautiful countryside home, was now in ruins, with shingles scattered, broken windows, and a lawn littered with debris. But it wasn't just the physical state of the house that troubled him. It was what the house represented, the burden of the past he had tried so hard to bury. He parked the car in front of the house and took a deep breath before stepping out. The air was heavy, humid, and the smell of wet wood and rust filled his lungs. The crunch of branches underfoot was the only sound that accompanied his steps toward the front door, now hanging loosely from its hinges. "You're late," his father's deep, weary voice echoed from the porch, where he sat, eyes fixed on the wreckage of the house. Jason wasn't sure how to start the conversation. "Traffic was rough," he replied, trying to hide the real reason for his delay. The fear of facing everything this place represented. Charles stood up slowly, the weight of age and years of struggle etched in his weathered face. "It wasn't the traffic that made you late, son." He knew. He knew Jason didn't want to come back. He knew that the ghosts of the past still haunted his son, just as they haunted him. The two entered the ruined house together. The wooden floor creaked under their feet, the cracked walls revealing the fragility of the structure. But what weighed most on Jason was the oppressive silence between him and his father. A silence filled with everything that had never been said about the racism they had faced, the fights, the unspoken tensions that had shaped his childhood. "I need to show you something," Charles said, breaking the silence, as he walked toward a room at the back of the house. Jason followed, feeling the weight of each step. When they entered the room, he saw a wall completely destroyed, exposing the interior of the house to the outside elements. But it wasn't the damage that made his stomach turn. It was what was trapped in the debris, an old photograph of his mother, Maria, hanging precariously. The frame was cracked, and the image of his mother smiling seemed out of place amidst the destruction. Charles approached the picture, his eyes gleaming with memory. "Your mother fought hard to make this house our home, so that, despite everything we went through here, we would have a place to call our own." Jason didn't know what to say. He remembered the nights when his mother comforted him, telling him that the world outside was cruel, but inside the house, he was safe. However, it hadn't always been that way. The quiet arguments between his parents about the injustices they faced, from neighbors, from authorities, were constant. His mother wanted to confront the prejudice head-on, while his father preferred silence, believing that keeping their heads down would keep them safe. "I thought that by leaving here, I could leave all of this behind," Jason finally admitted, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But you can never truly leave the past behind," Charles replied, his gaze serious. "The scars are always there, even when we can't see them." Jason felt the weight of those words. He knew that coming back to Clearwater wasn't just about rebuilding the house, but about confronting everything he had avoided for so long. The next morning, Jason stood outside the house, looking at the damage in the clear daylight. The storm had left the place in worse shape than he had imagined. While he assessed the structural damage, his thoughts kept drifting back to the emotional weight of being here. Every piece of debris seemed to trigger a memory of his childhood, some fond, others painful. As he walked around the side of the house, checking the foundation, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "What are you doing here?" Jason turned to see a middle-aged white man standing near the fence, arms crossed, with a look of disdain on his face. The man wore a sheriff's badge on his belt. Jason immediately recognized him. Sheriff Harris. He had been the deputy sheriff back when Jason was a kid, and though many years had passed, the man's expression hadn't changed. The same look of superiority, the same unspoken belief that Jason didn't belong there. "I'm helping my father rebuild his house," Jason replied, trying to keep his voice calm. Sheriff Harris narrowed his eyes, taking a slow step closer. "Your father's house? Last I checked, you hadn't been around these parts in years. What makes you think you can just stroll back in here?" Jason clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar surge of anger rise within him. "This is still my family's home," he said, trying to maintain control. "I have every right to be here." The sheriff's smirk widened, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Funny how people like you think you own something just because your name's on it. But let me remind you, this town hasn't changed much. You might have run off to the city, but here you're still just another one of them." Jason could feel the sting of the sheriff's words, not just in what he said, but in the weight of everything it implied. The same racism, the same prejudice he had fought so hard to escape, was still alive and well here. The sheriff's words cut deep, reigniting old wounds that Jason had worked hard to heal. Before Jason could respond, his father appeared at the doorway, his face tight with anger. "Sheriff, is there a problem here?" Charles asked, his voice steady, but with an edge that warned of his rising frustration. Sheriff Harris glanced at Charles and gave a small, mocking chuckle. "No problem, Mr. Williams. Just making sure your boy here understands how things work around here. You know how it is." Jason saw the way his father's shoulders tensed, the barely contained fury in his eyes. But Charles, as always, kept his composure. "We don't need any trouble, Sheriff. We're just here to fix the house." "Good," the sheriff said, tipping his hat with a sarcastic smile. "You folks stay out of trouble now." As the sheriff walked away, Jason's fists were clenched tightly at his sides. He wanted to lash out, to scream at the injustice, but the years of learned restraint kept him silent. He watched his father, wondering how Charles could stand there, so calm in the face of such blatant disrespect. Once the sheriff was out of sight, Jason finally spoke. "How can you just let him talk to us like that?" "Nothing's changed, Dad. These people still see us the same way they did when I was a kid." Charles sighed heavily, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Son, I've been dealing with people like him my whole life. You fight them, and they'll come back at you twice as hard. You keep your head down, and you get to live another day in peace." Jason shook his head, the frustration boiling inside him. "That's not peace, Dad. That's surviving." Charles didn't respond immediately. He simply turned and walked back into the house, leaving Jason standing alone, grappling with the same feeling of helplessness he had experienced so many times before. Before we continue with this powerful story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. That's how you can contribute and help us keep bringing you meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's continue. Days passed, and the weight of being back in Clearwater grew heavier on Jason's shoulders. The physical work of rebuilding the house was strenuous, but it was nothing compared to the emotional strain that came with every interaction he had in town. The small glances, the whispered conversations behind his back, it all felt suffocating. Despite his success in the city, here he was just the boy from the wrong side of town, and no amount of hard work or achievements could change that in their eyes. On the third day, Jason made his way into the town's hardware store to pick up some supplies. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the quiet chatter inside abruptly ceased. He could feel the eyes on him, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air like a thick fog. "Can I help you?" The voice belonged to a man behind the counter, a younger version of the same kind of person Jason had dealt with all his life. His name tag read Tyler, and though he didn't wear a badge, the superiority in his voice felt just like Sheriff Harris's. "I need some nails and a replacement hammer," Jason said, keeping his tone neutral as he handed over his list of supplies. Tyler looked at the list, then at Jason. "You sure you know how to use this stuff?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Jason's grip on the counter tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I've been doing this for a few days now. I think I'll manage." Tyler chuckled under his breath, clearly enjoying the little power trip. "Well, it's just, you don't really look like the type who knows his way around tools, you know?" Jason clenched his jaw, but stayed silent. He knew what Tyler was implying. It was the same tired, racist assumption he had heard his whole life, that he didn't belong in certain places or wasn't capable of doing certain things. After what felt like an eternity, Tyler gathered the supplies and rang them up. "That'll be $72, he said, leaning on the counter with a smirk. Jason handed over his credit card, only for Tyler to hesitate, holding the card up to the light as if inspecting it. "You sure this is yours?" he asked, his smirk widening. "I mean, you understand I got a check, right? Can't be too careful nowadays." Jason's chest tightened with anger. "Yeah, it's mine. Run it." Tyler shrugged, ran the card, and handed it back. "Just doing my job," he said with mock innocence. "You folks have a good day now." As Jason left the store, his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer frustration of having to endure these constant microaggressions. It was the same in the grocery store, at the gas station. Every interaction was a reminder that, to these people, he would always be less than. Back at the house, Jason found his father working on clearing out debris from the yard. He threw the supplies in the back of the truck, the anger still coursing through him. "Had another run-in with the local welcoming committee, huh?" Charles asked, not looking up from his work. Jason let out a frustrated breath. "Why do we put up with this, Dad? Every day, every interaction. It's like they're trying to remind us we don't belong here. Why don't we fight back?" Charles paused for a moment, then wiped the sweat from his brow. "Son, I fought them in my own way for years. But there's no winning against people who think they're better than you just because of the color of your skin. You can't change their minds. So, you do what you have to do to get by. You survive." Jason shook his head, pacing back and forth. "But I don't want to just survive. I want to live. I want to be able to walk into a store without being treated like a criminal, without having to prove I belong everywhere I go." "That's the difference between you and me," Charles said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. "I learned a long time ago that this world doesn't give us that choice." Jason stared at his father, the weight of those words sinking in. For Charles, life in Clearwater had always been about survival. But Jason had tasted something different in the city: freedom, success, respect. And now coming back here, it felt like all of that had been stripped away, leaving him exposed to the same old wounds. As the sun set over the ruined house, Jason felt more trapped than ever. Trapped by the expectations of this town, by the weight of his father's acceptance of their situation, and by the knowledge that nothing had truly changed, despite all his accomplishments. Later that night, Jason sat alone on the porch, staring out at the vast emptiness of the land around them. The stars above were bright, but they offered no comfort. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, as though every step forward he had taken in life was being undone. He thought about his mother, about the strength she had shown in the face of all the hatred and prejudice. She had been the one to push him to leave, to build a life where he wouldn't have to face the same daily battles. But now, sitting in the ruins of his past, Jason wondered if it had ever really been possible to escape. The following day, Jason and Charles continued their work on the house. The physical labor provided Jason with some relief from the constant emotional tension, but it wasn't enough to quiet the storm of thoughts swirling in his head. The more time he spent in Clearwater, the more he realized how deeply rooted the town's racism and prejudice were. Later in the afternoon, as Jason worked on the broken fence surrounding the yard, he heard the familiar rumble of a car pulling up. He didn't need to look to know who it was. Sheriff Harris's patrol car had become a regular presence ever since Jason arrived. "Working hard, I see," the sheriff said as he stepped out of the car, his voice carrying that same smug tone. Bet you're wishing you stayed up in the city where you belong, huh? Jason didn't respond immediately. He had learned over the years that people like Harris thrived on confrontation. They enjoyed pushing until they got a reaction. But Jason wasn't the same kid he had been when he left. He had learned to control his temper, to channel his frustration into something productive. "I'm just here to help my father," Jason finally replied, keeping his tone even. "That's all." Harris leaned against his car, looking at Jason with that same piercing gaze. "Funny, isn't it? You think just because you went off to the big city and made something of yourself, you're different now. But here, nothing's changed. You're still the same as you always were." Jason paused, looking directly at the sheriff. "And what exactly do you think I am, Sheriff?" The question seemed to catch Harris off guard for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "I think you're someone who forgot where you come from. Someone who thinks he's better than the rest of us, just because he wears fancy suits and drives a nice car now. But let me tell you something. In this town, you'll always be who you were born to be, and nothing you do will change that." Jason clenched his fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. Harris's words were meant to provoke, to remind Jason of his place in the town's racial hierarchy. It was the same message Jason had been hearing his whole life, that no matter how successful he became, to them, he was still less than. "You know, Harris," Jason said, his voice steady, "I used to think that people like you were the ones in control, that no matter how hard I worked or how much I achieved, I'd always be seen the way you wanted to see me. But the truth is, I'm not defined by this town or by your narrow view of the world. I define myself." Harris's face hardened, the smirk fading as Jason spoke. For the first time, the sheriff seemed unsure of how to respond. Jason's words had hit a nerve, challenging the very foundation of the power dynamic Harris had built his authority on. Before Harris could reply, Charles appeared on the porch, his face lined with concern. "Is there a problem here, Sheriff?" Harris glanced at Charles, his expression darkening. "No problem, Mr. Williams. Just having a chat with your boy, making sure he understands how things work around here." Charles's eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained calm. "We don't need your reminders, Sheriff. We're just here to rebuild. That's all." Harris gave a tight, humorless smile. "Sure thing. But don't forget, this town remembers everything. And some things don't change, no matter how much time passes." With that, Harris got back in his car and drove off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and tension in his wake. Jason watched him go, the frustration boiling inside him. "Why do you let him talk to you like that?" he asked, turning to his father. "Why do you let him get away with it?" Charles sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping with the weight of years of silent endurance. "I've fought my battles, Jason. I fought them my whole life, and it wore me down. At some point, you just want peace. You want to be left alone. That's all I've ever wanted." "But that's not peace, Dad," Jason said, shaking his head. "That's surrender." Charles looked at his son, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. "You don't understand, Jason. You think you can change things, but this town, it's built on these ideas. They don't see us as equals. They never will." Jason's heart ached at his father's words, at the deep-rooted belief that change was impossible. He had always admired his father's quiet strength, but now he saw it for what it was: survival. His father had learned to survive by avoiding conflict, by keeping his head down. But Jason wasn't built that way. He couldn't just ignore the injustice around him, even if it meant standing alone. A look into Sheriff Harris's character. As Sheriff Harris drove away, his mind raced. Jason Williams was different now, and it unsettled him. There was something about the way Jason looked at him, a confidence that Harris hadn't seen before. It was the kind of confidence that came from someone who had tasted success, who had lived in a world beyond Clearwater's borders. And it scared him. Harris wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone like Jason. He had spent his entire career maintaining the status quo in Clearwater, keeping people like Jason and his family in their place. It was how things worked, an unspoken hierarchy that had been in place for generations. But now, Jason was challenging that, and it threatened the delicate balance Harris had worked so hard to maintain. The sheriff knew that if Jason continued to push back, it could inspire others to do the same. And that was something Harris couldn't allow. In the back of his mind, Harris knew that his power in this town was fragile. It was built on fear and respect, but fear only worked as long as people didn't question it. And Jason was questioning it. For the first time in years, Harris felt a flicker of doubt, a fear that the control he had grown so comfortable with might be slipping away. Jason awoke the next morning with a sense of renewed determination. The confrontation with Sheriff Harris had been unsettling, but it had also sparked something inside him, a resolve to no longer accept the way things had always been. He had spent too many years running from his past, but now it was time to confront it head-on. He wasn't just here to rebuild a house. He was here to reclaim his family's dignity. As he and his father worked on clearing out the debris from the front yard, Jason noticed a figure approaching from down the road. It was a man Jason didn't recognize, younger, well-dressed, and carrying a clipboard. As he came closer, Jason could see that the man had an air of authority about him, but there was something different. He didn't carry the same sense of disdain that the others in town did. "Morning," the man said as he reached the yard. "I'm Robert Davis, with the town council. I heard you've been working on rebuilding this place, and I wanted to come by to offer some help." Jason exchanged a surprised glance with his father. It wasn't often that someone from the town council, especially someone like Robert, who was younger and seemingly more open-minded, offered help to families like theirs. "That's unexpected," Jason said cautiously. "What kind of help are you offering?" Robert smiled, his tone genuine. "Well, after the storm, the town received some funds for reconstruction. I know that this part of town hasn't always received the attention it deserves, but I'm trying to change that. I want to make sure everyone gets the assistance they need to rebuild, regardless of where they live." Jason could hardly believe what he was hearing. After days of facing nothing but hostility, this felt like a small glimmer of hope. Maybe things were changing after all. Maybe the next generation, people like Robert, were willing to look past the prejudices that had defined Clearwater for so long. Charles, however, remained cautious. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "What's in it for you?" Robert's expression softened. "Look, I know this town has a lot of history and not all of it is good. I grew up here, too. I've seen the way certain families have been treated, and I'm trying to make things right. This grant is a step in that direction." Jason felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Robert truly was different. Maybe the town wasn't as stuck in its old ways as he thought. He glanced at his father, who still looked skeptical, but Jason was ready to accept the help. After all, they needed it. The house was in ruins, and any assistance could make a huge difference. "All right," Jason said, nodding. "We could use the help." Robert smiled and handed Jason a form. "Great. Just fill this out, and we can get started on getting the materials and labor support you need." Jason took the form, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time since he had returned to Clearwater, it felt like things were starting to look up. Over the next few days, Robert's promises seemed to come to fruition. Workers arrived to help clear the yard and remove the larger debris, and new materials were delivered to the site. Jason worked alongside them, feeling a sense of momentum building. Maybe, just maybe, this town was finally ready to change. But just as things seemed to be improving, a dark shadow loomed over Jason's newfound hope. On the 5th day, as Jason and the workers were installing new windows in the house, Sheriff Harris's patrol car pulled up once again. Jason's heart sank as he saw Harris step out. But this time, the sheriff wasn't alone. 2 other officers accompanied him, their expressions stern and serious. "Jason Williams," Harris called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to have a word." Jason wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped forward, his stomach twisting with a sense of foreboding. "What's this about, Sheriff?" Harris's smirk returned, though this time it was tinged with malice. "We've had some reports of stolen materials. Seems like some of the supplies you've been using here were taken from another construction site." Jason's blood ran cold. "What? That's impossible. All of these materials came from the town's grant program." Robert Davis arranged everything. Harris's expression darkened. "Robert Davis? Funny thing about that. Turns out there's no record of him submitting any paperwork for this project. In fact, I spoke to the town council this morning, and they said they never approved any materials for your house." Jason's heart raced. This couldn't be happening. Robert had seemed so genuine, so willing to help, but now it looked like everything had been a setup. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jason said, his voice steady but laced with anxiety. "Robert handled everything. I didn't steal anything." Harris stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "That's not what the council says. So either you're lying or you've been played. Either way, I'm going to need you to come down to the station to answer a few questions." Jason's mind raced. This was a nightmare. He had done everything by the book, trusted the process, and now it was all falling apart. He glanced at the workers, who had stopped what they were doing, watching the scene unfold in uncomfortable silence. His father stood on the porch, his face a mask of anger and worry. "I'm not going anywhere," Jason said, trying to stand his ground. "I didn't do anything wrong." Harris's smirk widened. "We'll see about that. But until we get this sorted out, you won't be using any more of these materials. This project is on hold." With that, Harris turned and walked back to his car, leaving Jason standing there, his fists clenched, his heart pounding in his chest. What had started as a glimmer of hope had turned into a nightmare. The one person who had offered him help had disappeared, and now Jason was left to pick up the pieces of a situation that seemed impossible to fix. Jason stood frozen, watching Sheriff Harris and his officers drive away. The words, "This project is on hold," ringing in his ears. The sense of betrayal washed over him like a tidal wave. How could things have spiraled so quickly from hope to disaster? Robert Davis, the man who had seemed like a beacon of change, had vanished without a trace, leaving Jason to deal with the fallout alone. His father, Charles, approached slowly, his face set in a grim expression. "I knew it was too good to be true," he muttered under his breath. Jason turned to him, his frustration boiling over. "How can you just stand there and say that? We were finally getting somewhere. Things were starting to change. And now," his voice broke, his anger barely contained. "Now I look like a criminal." Charles placed a firm hand on Jason's shoulder, his grip strong despite his age. "Son, I've been around long enough to know when something is too easy. The moment Robert came here offering help, I had a bad feeling. Nothing comes without a price, especially not in a town like this." Jason shook his head, stepping away from his father's grip. "So, what do we do? Just sit here and let them tear everything down? Let them keep treating us like we're less than human?" Charles sighed, his eyes filled with a sorrow that Jason recognized. It was the same look he had seen on his father's face throughout his childhood. The look of someone who had learned to live with the unfairness of the world, because fighting back always seemed to make things worse. "You have to be smart about this," Charles said softly. "Rage won't fix this. You need to find a way to clear your name without giving them more reason to come after you." Jason clenched his fists, his jaw tight with frustration. "So, what? I'm supposed to just let them think I'm guilty? Let them get away with it?" Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the house, leaving Jason standing alone in the yard, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. That night, Jason couldn't sleep. His mind raced, replaying the events of the last few days. Every glance, every whispered conversation in town now seemed to carry a heavier meaning. They had all been waiting for him to fail, waiting for the moment they could say, "See, he's just like we thought he was." The next morning, Jason decided he couldn't sit idly by. He needed answers. He needed to find Robert Davis and figure out what had happened. He drove into town, his mind set on confronting the man who had left him in this mess. Jason pulled up to the town hall, his pulse quickening as he walked inside. The building was quiet, with only a few clerks busy at their desks. He approached the front desk, where a woman in her late 50s sat, typing away on an old computer. "Excuse me," Jason said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm looking for Robert Davis. He was helping me with a project at my father's house." The woman glanced up, her expression blank. "Robert Davis," she repeated. "I'm sorry, but we don't have anyone by that name working here." Jason frowned. "That's impossible." He said he was from the town council. He arranged for workers and materials for the reconstruction of our house after the storm. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "I've worked here for over 20 years, and I can assure you, there's no one named Robert Davis on the town council or working for this office." Jason's heart sank. "But I spoke to him. He came to my house. He brought workers' materials. He promised he was here to help." "I'm sorry," the woman said, her tone flat, "but there's no record of anyone by that name. Maybe you should talk to the sheriff if you think something suspicious is going on." Jason's mind raced. Robert had vanished, and now it seemed like he had never existed at all. Had he been set up from the start? Was this all part of some larger plan to discredit him, to push him out of Clearwater for good? As he left the town hall, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deep this ran. It wasn't just about Robert Davis or the missing materials. This was bigger. It was about the town itself, a place that had never wanted him or his family to succeed. A place that thrived on keeping people like him in their place. When Jason returned to the house, he found Charles sitting on the porch, staring out at the remains of their home. The sight of his father, once so strong and proud, now reduced to quiet resignation, only fueled Jason's determination. "I went to the town hall," Jason said, his voice tight with frustration. "They said Robert Davis doesn't exist. There's no record of him, no paperwork, nothing. It's like he was never here." Charles nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "I told you, son, this town has a way of making people disappear, of erasing things they don't want to deal with." Jason sat down beside his father, his mind spinning with anger, fear, and a growing sense of hopelessness. How could they fight against something so insidious, so deeply embedded in the fabric of the town? For the first time since returning to Clearwater, Jason felt truly powerless. It wasn't just the physical destruction of the house that weighed on him. It was the realization that no matter how hard he fought, the forces working against him were too entrenched, too determined to maintain the status quo. But even as the weight of the situation pressed down on him, Jason refused to give up. He had come too far, endured too much to let this town break him. He would find a way, somehow, to reclaim what had been taken from him, not just his home, but his dignity, his sense of self-worth. "I'm not going to let them win," Jason said quietly, more to himself than to his father. "I'm going to find a way to fix this." Charles glanced at his son, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and worry. "Just be careful, Jason. This town doesn't take it lightly when people try to shake things up." Jason nodded, but in his heart, he knew there was no turning back now. The crisis had intensified, and with every new obstacle, he felt the resolve inside him harden. He would find out who Robert Davis really was, and he would expose the truth, no matter the cost. Jason knew that the next step had to be a confrontation. He couldn't sit back and let the pieces of this twisted game fall into place without doing something. He needed answers, and the only person who could give them was Sheriff Harris. Jason had no idea how deep the corruption went, but he knew Harris was involved, one way or another. The sun had already begun to set when Jason pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. His heart raced, but his resolve was solid. He wasn't the scared kid who used to avoid confrontation at all costs. Now, he was a man with everything to lose, and he couldn't afford to walk away. Inside the sheriff's office, the air was thick with tension. As Jason walked in, The few deputies on duty glanced at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. They knew who he was, the outsider who had dared to come back and stir things up. Harris was sitting at his desk, going over paperwork. He didn't even look up as Jason entered. "What can I do for you, Williams?" he asked in a cold, detached tone, as if he had been expecting this confrontation all along. Jason stepped closer, standing just in front of the sheriff's desk. "We need to talk," Jason said, his voice calm but laced with anger. "About Robert Davis and the setup you've been running." Harris finally looked up, a slow smile creeping across his face. "Robert Davis, huh? You still chasing ghosts, Jason?" Jason's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to remain composed. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. You set me up. You and whoever else is pulling the strings in this town. You used Robert to make me look like a thief, and now you're trying to bury me." Harris leaned back in his chair, the smugness in his eyes unmistakable. "Is that what you think? That we're all out to get you? Let me tell you something, Jason, you've always been an outsider. You left this town because you couldn't handle what it takes to survive here. And now you come back, thinking you're better than everyone else, expecting special treatment." Jason leaned forward, his eyes locked on Harris. "This isn't about survival, and it's not about special treatment. It's about what's right. You and the people in this town have been living off this system for years, using it to keep people like my family down. But that ends now." Harris's smile faded, replaced by a hard, calculating look. "You think you can change this town? You think anyone cares what happens to you or your family? This place doesn't change, Jason. People like you don't change things." Jason stared at him, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't need to change the town. I just need to expose you for what you are. Once people see the truth, you won't be able to hide behind your badge anymore." Harris's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Jason saw a flicker of something that resembled fear. The sheriff leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near growl. "You don't know what you're getting into, boy. You think you're the first to try and stir things up around here? We've been dealing with your kind for generations, and we know how to handle it." Jason felt the surge of anger rising again, but he held it back, refusing to give Harris the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "You can threaten me all you want, Harris, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to find Robert Davis, or whoever he really is, and when I do, you'll be the one who has to answer for everything you've done." Harris's smile returned, though it was colder now, more calculating. "Good luck with that. But I'll give you a word of advice, Jason. Some things are better left buried. If you keep digging, you might not like what you find." Jason didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the office, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily on his shoulders. He had expected Harris to deny everything, but the sheriff's cryptic words only confirmed what Jason had feared. There was something deeper at play, something that went far beyond just stolen materials or false accusations. As Jason drove back toward his father's house, his mind raced. He couldn't let this go. He had come too far, and now the stakes were higher than ever. But he also knew that he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who were willing to stand with him and expose the truth. When he arrived back home, Charles was waiting for him on the porch. His father's face was tense, as if he knew that Jason's visit to the sheriff's office hadn't gone well. "What happened?" Charles asked, his voice low. Jason sat down beside his father, the weight of the day pressing down on him. "Harris knows," Jason said. "He knows everything, but he's not going to admit it. He thinks I'll give up and walk away." Charles was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "Are you going to give up?" Jason shook his head. "No, I'm going to keep pushing, but I can't do it alone. I need help." Charles nodded, his expression softening. "Then you're not alone, son. I may not agree with everything you're doing, but I won't let you fight this battle on your own." Jason felt a swell of emotion at his father's words. It was the first time since he had returned to Clearwater that he truly felt supported. He had been fighting so hard to prove himself, to stand against the injustices of the town, but now he realized that this was bigger than just him. This was about his family, about the generations of people who had been silenced and oppressed in this town. And now, with his father by his side, he wasn't going to back down. Together, they would face the storm that was coming. And this time, Jason was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The days that followed the confrontation with Sheriff Harris were tense and uncertain. Jason knew that the sheriff's warning wasn't empty, but he also knew that he couldn't back down. The truth had to come out, and the only way to do that was by finding Robert Davis, or whoever was behind this deception. Jason and Charles worked tirelessly to gather any information they could. They spoke to old friends and community members, hoping to find someone who had seen Robert or knew of his whereabouts. But Clearwater was a town where people kept their heads down, afraid to speak up, afraid of the consequences. One evening, just as Jason was beginning to lose hope, a breakthrough came. An old neighbor, Mrs. Edwards, who had always been kind to the Williams family, came to the house under the cover of darkness. She was nervous, her hands shaking as she handed Jason a folded piece of paper. "I don't want to be involved," she whispered, "but I know what's happening isn't right. I saw him. Robert, or whatever his name is. He's not from the town council. He works for a construction company in the next town over. They've been using people like him to make deals with families like yours, promising help but pocketing the money themselves." Jason's heart pounded as he unfolded the paper. It was a business card for a company called Silverstone Construction. The name Robert Davis was printed at the bottom, but the title under his name read Project Manager. He wasn't from the council. He had been using his position in the company to exploit families affected by the storm, pocketing the grant money while leaving them to face the blame when things fell apart. Jason thanked Mrs. Edwards, promising her that her name would be kept out of it. Armed with this new information, he knew he finally had the evidence he needed. The next morning, Jason and Charles drove to the neighboring town, determined to confront Robert Davis and expose the scheme once and for all. At the Silverstone construction office, Jason found Robert sitting at his desk, surrounded by blueprints and paperwork. For a moment, Robert looked surprised to see him, but that surprise quickly turned into a smirk. "Well, if it isn't the prodigal son," Robert said, leaning back in his chair. "What can I do for you, Jason?" Jason tossed the business card onto the desk. "This ends now," he said, his voice steady but filled with anger. "I know what you've been doing. You've been exploiting families, taking advantage of the storm and the grant money, and leaving people like us to take the fall." Robert's smirk faded, but he remained calm. "You can't prove anything. It's your word against mine." Jason stepped forward, leaning over the desk. "Maybe it was, but I've got people who saw you, people who know exactly what you've been up to. And once I bring this to the media, to the town council, you'll have nowhere to hide." For the first time, Jason saw a flicker of fear in Robert's eyes. He wasn't as untouchable as he thought. The calm, smug exterior began to crack. "You're bluffing," Robert said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had before. "Try me," Jason shot back. "I'm not walking away this time. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you've done." Robert's eyes darted to the door, as if calculating his next move. But before he could say anything else, Charles stepped forward. "You've made a mistake, son," he said in a low, firm voice. "You messed with the wrong family." With no other option, Robert finally relented. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jason straightened up, his eyes cold and determined. "You're going to fix this. You're going to make sure that every cent of that grant money is used to repair our house. And then you're going to walk away, or I'll make sure you never work in this town again." Robert swallowed hard, his bravado gone. He knew he had been cornered. Later that week, the materials and workers returned to the Williams house, this time under legitimate contracts. The work progressed quickly, and Jason, alongside his father, oversaw every aspect of the reconstruction, making sure there were no more tricks. But the true victory came a few days later, when a local journalist, whom Jason had contacted after finding Robert, published an exposé on the corruption in Clearwater. The article named Robert Davis and his company as key players in a scheme to defraud storm victims, but it also touched on the broader issue of systemic racism in the town, shining a light on the way families, like the Williamses, had been treated for decades. Sheriff Harris, who had been implicated in the article as complicit in covering up the fraud, faced immediate backlash. The town council was forced to launch an investigation, and within weeks, Harris resigned in disgrace. As the dust settled, Jason stood in front of the newly rebuilt house, the weight of everything that had happened still fresh in his mind. He hadn't just rebuilt a home. He had reclaimed a part of his family's dignity, something that had been stolen from them long before the storm. Charles stood beside him, his face softer than Jason had seen it in years. "You did good, son," he said quietly. "You didn't back down." Jason smiled, a sense of peace washing over him for the first time since he'd returned. "We did it, Dad. Together." The scars of the past would always remain, but now they were no longer invisible. They had been exposed, confronted, and in some ways healed. As they walked back into the house, Jason felt a new sense of purpose. Clearwater hadn't changed overnight, but it had taken the first step. And now, with the truth out in the open, there was hope for a better future. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of resilience and justice. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. We have many more powerful stories that highlight overcoming adversity, just like this one. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and let's keep spreading the message of hope and change. See you in the next one.